there is an urgent need for us to find comfort in rethinking our pathway to genuinely creating a better life for all. Now, this afternoon, like we did in the previous sessions, we switch from the academic perspectives to two sessions with Professor Standing and Professor Taylor, and seek perspectives from the Statistician General, two representatives from the private sector, and one representative from civil society. First will be Mr. Risenga Maluleke, who is our esteemed Statistician General. He will be followed by Mr. Colin Coleman, who is the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, no stranger to South African political discourse, as well as the current senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University. And then Mr. Coleman will be followed by Ms. Isobel Fryer, and I hope I pronounced that well, Isobel, who is director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Now, without wasting much time, I will move straight to our Statistician General. I know it's been a very busy day for you releasing unemployment figures, Mr. Maluleke. Could you give us a snapshot of the state of poverty and inequality in South Africa today? Who are the poorest of the poor in this country? Where are they based mostly? And what does their plight look like?
Thank you indeed, Mukove, and I need to appreciate this platform you have given us as Stats SA. And indeed, the role of Statistics South Africa is not to dabble into policies, just to make numbers available. It's even a lot more interesting when we are talking on the ANC platform, because we must always, and not even the ANC, it could have been the DA or any other political party, we must always demonstrate that we are free from political influence. So I will just share the numbers, and it will be quite interesting. We have just released today the quarterly the quarterly labor force survey that indicates that unemployment is sitting at 23.3%. I've seen a lot of commentators saying that Stats SA is actually bringing the unemployment right for political expediency. But if you ask me, we always measure according to international best practice, and the guidelines that come from the International Labour Organization also prevail to us. And in this regard, I want to say that unemployment is a function of being actively looking for employment, and being able to take up such employment whenever it becomes available. And in this regard, the people of South Africa, as we have seen in other regions of the world, didn't actively look for employment because they were seated at home during lockdowns that were implemented by different countries, and indeed ours as South Africa. On the GDP side, we have seen the economy contracting by 51% as seasonally adjusted and annualized. But when we look at the unadjusted rate, quarter on quarter, it contracted by 16.4%. And I need to say all these things because they play a critical role when you look at matters of poverty later. Now, I want to start, and Faisal is loading a slide that talks to upper bound and lower bound poverty, so that we can get straight to that. And beyond that, we will take a few more slides. Now, what we are saying is that in the National Development Plan, South Africa is tracking the lower bound poverty line. So what we are saying is that anybody who cannot earn, as of April 2020, who cannot earn 840 rands per person per month will remain, poor. That's what we are saying. And we are talking about this because it's very, very critical to understand that these are people who have to choose between food and important non-food items. Those who earn below 585 rand per month will remain what we call food poor. So that's the food poverty line. But the NDP asks us to focus on this one. But we want to understand that over time, we have been releasing, as let's say, numbers that show from where we were in the year 2006, the rising poverty lines from the upper bound, lower bound, and food poverty line. And it's critical to understand that this because inflation keeps on steadily rising. What you could buy in 2006 for a rand, you cannot afford to buy today. And on the basis of that, we are saying that 40% of South Africans remain poor according to the lower bound poverty line, which we are tracking in the NDP. And this is up to 2015 or in 2015. And I'm saying this because beyond 2015, Stats SA hasn't conducted any income and expenditure survey to help us compute the poverty lines, and not the poverty lines, to understand the number of people as in persons or the head count of the number of people that are poor. While from the prices side, we've been producing this, funds have prevailed on us not to be able to conduct the income and expenditure income. But a survey. And in this regard, we also have another one called the South African Multidimensional Poverty Index. And this plays a critical role because we look at matters of, internationally, they look at health, education, and living standards. In living standards is whether you have electricity for cooking, you have water, sanitation, dwelling. This is very critical because in the previous one where we spoke about the financials, how much you need to have per day, per month. In this regard, you could not have these ones, but you could have a situation where government, and not only in South Africa, different governments do intervene for purposes of providing a safety net for their citizenry. And in our case as South Africa, we don't call it just the multidimensional poverty, MPI. We call it the SAMPI because we have introduced economic activity in the form of unemployment. And what we will see in the next slide is that our SAMPI is declining. It's coming out of 2001, where it was sitting at 17.9%, almost 18%, 2011, 8%, and 7% as of 2016. What it means here is that whatever government is doing to provide a safety cushion for the poorest of the poor does work, because then we are sitting at an international level. Whereas on the other side, when we use the money metric one, where we looked at the money, how much you need to earn, it has been steadily rising from 2011, indicating that for those who cannot earn that amount, they are facing more challenges. Now, let us look at the poorest of the poor. Which districts are the poorest of the poor? These districts are actually largely in the provinces of KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. And the top 10 start with Nsika to all the way to Nguza Hill. These are the poorest of the poor in the country. And as we look at them, we are able to say that we need to look at drivers of poverty. What drives poverty in our country? Mm-hmm. What drives poverty in our country, facilitator? The main drivers are unemployment and the years of schooling. Both of them, as of 2016, accounted for 63% combined. That is 52% from unemployment, and from the side of years of schooling, that is education. It accounted for 11%, and both of them accounted for 63%. What it means, and that's why I started with the issues of the economy and unemployment, is that when people can't get employed, they can't have income. And then the basis of that, they will not be able to live well. And the reality is that the lesser educated the people are, the lesser they are unable to find employment. Mukobe, you will tell me when I need to stop. I have lost count of my time, but I need to know when to stop and when. Now, we need to look at the racial breakdown by population group in terms of who earns what. And let us say that our Gini coefficient as a country is dropping. But as it is dropping, and Gini coefficient shows the difference between those who have and those who do not have in the society. But what we are seeing is that the whites in South Africa earn a lot more, about on average, and we are talking about households here, on average about 444,000. And as they earn so, they spend about 350,000. So they have about 100,000 of disposable income that they can use for whatever they need to use. The Indian Asians are earning about 271,000 and they spend about 195,000. So they have about 80,000 of disposable income. The coloreds earn about 172 and they spend about 124. They have about 50,000 rands of disposable income, and that this is per annum. And the Black Africans earn about 92,000 rands on average, 93,000 rands on average, and spend about 68,000 rands on average, which means that they have less than 30,000 rands of disposable income. Now, let us look at the white population group that has about 100,000 all the way to the Black African. In the end, when we look at the share of income by share of population group, let us take the whites, for example. Their income is about 36.4%. That is their share of income. Whereas in population group, the size of the population here is 8.3%. Now, let us look at the Black Africans, for example. Their share of income is about 49.3%, slightly below 50%, yet they account for more than 80% of the population. Now, I will rush to other slides in terms of men and women, male and female. And I want us to look at, as of 2016, individuals living in male-headed households accounted for almost 3/4 of total household expenditure in the country. And we can see the blue color there. That is showing us that the male-headed households on the expenditure side, we're having a 74% versus 26% of female-headed households. Now, let us look. I spoke about the intervention by government in terms of providing a social cushion. Firstly, in South Africa, about 60% of our income is generated from salaries. That's about 59% to be exact. But let us look at the yellow color particularly. That is grants. And these grants, if we look, especially in the provinces of Eastern Cape, which is the second line from the top, in grants account for 35% of the income of the households in the Eastern Cape. That is followed by Limpopo at 30% and followed by the Northern Cape. Generally, rural provinces are actually having more grants than the national average, because we can see below the RSA, the two lower ones are Gauteng and the Western Cape, which anyway have the highest proportion of their salaries, their income coming from salaries. And in this regard, what it tells us is that in the rural provinces, while your grants are not the highest source of income, they provide the cushion, especially in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, where we have seen that the poorest of the poor are there. Now, I want to spend my last input talking about the girl child on education. We have already seen that male-headed households stand a better advantage. There is a slide we didn't bring here, which shows that women, even the most educated women, earn about 92% of what men earn. Actually, on average, women in South Africa earn 78% of what men earn. But the girl child, when the reasons why children are not at school, 7 to 18 years, it's largely for different reasons, no money, all these issues. But in relation to family commitment, the girl child with a lighter color of purple there is stopped from going to school whenever an uncle is sick or whenever there's a sick member because of family responsibility. Sometimes the girl child is looking after the children of their own. They are looking after children of their own. Whereas boy children are free from family commitment. And when it comes to them not going to school, The boy children are saying education is not important, as we'll see. You can see they are swapping. When we talk about the importance of education, the boy child says, education is not important, but the girl child says, education is important. I want to go to school, but the girl child is not allowed. The next slide says Ndihela Kwala, and I need to explain it briefly in a few seconds. When I was young, growing up in the village in Limpopo, our parents, our fathers used to work as migrant workers in major cities like Johannesburg, Cape Town, everywhere. Our mothers who used to write letters using us as scribes because our mothers were illiterate, couldn't end a letter by saying, I love you, my husband, or I miss you, because children were not supposed to hear those words. When they write them down, they would go blind. If they hear them, they would go deaf. So the standard way of finishing a letter was Ndihela Kwala, meaning that I finish here. But it's got a message in it that never and never in the history of our country or that of the world should we allow any section of the society, the poor or otherwise, women and children, the girl child or otherwise, not to be able to express themselves because we have excluded them and leave them in poverty. We should leave no one behind. And the next slide seems to be blank. And as such, I will not be able to continue. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think I precisely sought that particular context or background in order to give our discussion context, and the data that we have been presented with is particularly to lay a foundation for the discussion that is to follow. I will now move to Mr. Coleman, precisely because of a presentation he made at the University of Cape Town on the 15th of July this year. You delivered the University of Cape Town Vice Chancellor's open lecture, during which you make a case for a basic income grant, amongst other recommendations, to be implemented as early as next month. Specifically in your opening statement, you argue that there is no country that can survive the kind of unemployment that South Africa is currently enduring at the moment. Why does South Africa need a basic income today? And what about the prevailing conditions in SA would a basic income grant then remedy? Mr. Coleman.
Thanks very much, Mkuve, and congratulations to you on the very professional manner in which you've conducted this, and it's been a pleasure to be part of it.
Thanks
the picture behind me, the work of art, is not coincidental, because what that image tells you is that we all need to think, and we all need to reimagine our worlds. We cannot be bound by ideological traps, be prisoners of ideology, nor economic orthodoxy. And the post-COVID world, as around the world, whether in where I am in New York at the moment, in London, in the European capitals, in Asia, there is a dramatic rethinking, reimagining of capitalism in the developed world. And you have mainstream financial journals like The Economist and the Financial Times calling for a reimagining of capitalism, including the concept of a basic income grant, including unemployment benefits. And these spectrum of interventions from a fiscal stimulus side, and these countries obviously have tremendous power and economic resilience, and the ability to undertake trillions of dollars of stimulus, which South Africa doesn't, range from effectively intervening and paying very significant fractions of the employment wages, right to paying for people to go to restaurants in London, to be subsidized in order to stimulate aspects of the economy. And so, you know, we really have to get out of, somebody said to me, navel gazing in South Africa and look at the world with fresh eyes. Because when you hear the Statistician General, and it's a great pleasure to be on a panel with him, talking about these levels of unemployment, and I'm going to give it my own color quickly, It means that when I delivered this UCT lecture, I started with the words South Africa is in trouble. And it's in trouble because the levels of unemployment, inequality, and the legacy from which that comes means that unless the political organizations respond to the popular reality on the ground, the masses will define their own solutions, and those may be, as we've seen in various countries, reactionary populist solutions. They may be progressive solutions, but the African National Congress obviously has been battling to try and articulate a vision, practice, and implementation strategy that makes the difference. And I do agree that the social welfare and broad interventions of the last 26 years have created the rise of a lower middle class in South Africa and protected the poor, but COVID has stripped away significant aspects of that. So today, the reality is, when you look at this quarterly labor force survey, that whilst we had 16.5 million people in employment prior to COVID, we now have 14.1 million in employment. We had, prior to COVID, 10.8 million unemployed. So if you add this 2.2 million, we're really at 12 million unemployed, and we are at 14.1 million employed. Now, so the expanded unemployment rate of 42% may be an aberration because of technical factors of taking this 5 million people out of the labor force. But over time, we will see that the unemployment rate is dangerously close to 50%. And no country can survive that level of unemployment. I did say that when I spoke. And I think the Statistician General has kind of highlighted many aspects of how it differentiates and speaks to women, youth, and Black people in South Africa in a disproportionate way. And so as a result, my view is South Africa needs to have, within the constraints of our GDP growth, that in numbers is officially forecast to drop by 8% in 2020. 8% of 5 trillion is 400 billion. So we've lost 400 billion rand of GDP, and we are going to have to work out ways of regaining that and regaining the 300 billion rand of taxes. And actually spending, as I quantified, 140 billion rand, which is what it would take to fund 10.8 million unemployed people with 1,080 rand per month. That's 140 billion. That 140 billion's investment in a basic income grant to direct and focus on the unemployed, and I'll come back to that in a second, is a very practical and very directly beneficial stimulus to those with most in need. And let's remember, besides the tax clawbacks and various things that people talk about, the stimulus effects for those people being able to buy food, clothing, and essentials, in terms of how that will then stimulate the economy back into the food, clothing, retail sector, and be also a driver of economic activity, and with it increased VAT payments and increased corporate tax, has a lot of benefits. Now, I wouldn't be proposing this if we couldn't fund this in a fiscally neutral way. I know you're going to have a second round where we'll talk about how, right. But I have looked at the tax system in a lot of detail and quantified how we can redistribute 140 billion rand of existing tax net so that we gain. Now, this will involve some sacrifices to the middle class and to the wealthy, but what they will be achieving through that is a greater much more stable, secure society in which the 10.8 million South Africans are unemployed, who really, frankly, and we must all be honest, have no hope of employment really in the short term, in the next year or two. The government's economic program is going to take time, in the best case scenario, to take off. And so we cannot abandon, effectively almost 15% to 20% of the population in South Africa. We cannot abandon these people. We have to take care of this, and as a moral, compassionate movement, we have to show that South Africans from the top down are prepared to make the sacrifices to help those most in need. So perhaps I should pause there, because you were asking me why we need it and what is the economic benefit and the societal benefit, and I'll come back to how we fund it if you like later.
Certainly. And in fact, before I let you go, Mr. Coleman, I just want to touch briefly on something you mentioned, which we don't hear enough of, neither here in South Africa or around the world for that matter. This issue of prospects for employment creation. The extent of unemployment prior to the pandemic was already at historic highs. And a lot of comments that we receive planning for this particular conversation, it always borders in the lines of basic income grant would be free money, people need jobs instead. And I understand the level of attachment and value that people attach to jobs, but what are the odds of this massive employment that is so desperately needed? And does that necessarily act as a countermeasure to efforts that seeks to realize a basic income, or can the two coexist moving forward?
Big is not a replacement for our need to grow the economy 3 to 5% in the medium and the longer term, nor is it a replacement for us needing to create 5 million jobs. And in the Cape Town speech, in the 10-point plan, I talked about reimagining our industrialization architecture, our spatial apartheid architecture. I talked about our infrastructure plan, but our practical way of dealing with the infrastructure plan. So all of those things need to take place. But let's be very clear. Any conservative bland commentary that says a basic income grant is going to create dependency in South Africa is articulating an extremely callous view of the world, because 1,080 Rand a month into the hands of people who have no income is purely helping them subsist. This is not replacing their need to go and find work. So their driver to find work will still be there, but you will be giving them a helping hand. It's Martin Luther King who said a bootstrap man, cannot lift the bootstraps. And if you have the hand on the neck and they don't have bootstraps, they're not going to pick themselves up the ground. That's a summary, a précis of his comment. But it's extremely current in the world. I'm walked down the street in New York, and I can tell you the homelessness picture in New York has become dramatically increased. And I'm sure in South Africa, the same visual picture of unemployment and poverty, and that threatening our democracy in the short, medium, and long term is very current.
No, thanks a lot for that. I'll come back to the issue of instability and insecurity that you raised, which I think are just as critical for the collective well-being of any nation. But Isobel, this may be an ideal time actually to bring you in, because I was quite surprised to see what Mr. Coleman is saying on the editorial of the New York Times. As soon as the pandemic happened, the idea of a basic income grant was in a way put forward as one of the ways or one of the policy options that need to be on the table. But your research and advocacy work around basic income far predates the pandemic or the hype that it has picked up around the world, really. And so from your years of research and advocacy work, what in your view would be the main justifications for why a post-apartheid, and I say post-apartheid conceptually, because sometimes the word post-apartheid is used to describe a South Africa today that is somehow detached to the apartheid South Africa. But in your view, why does South Africa so desperately need a basic income today? And what is the research experience around the world saying?
Thanks very much, Makove, and thanks for inviting me. I have got some slides, some of it has been touched on already by the two comprehensive presentations, but let me just proceed with those.
There you
go. So just in trying to collate some of the information around the questions, I'm just going to very briefly look at the poverty trends, unemployment, I mean, today's figures. Something which people haven't touched on, that's the obligations on the state in terms of the Constitution, which is something which we should never move away from. Looking at the current social security coverage and global findings. I'm going to be speaking really quickly because we have 10 minutes, so that's basically a minute a slide. But I just wanted to start. Okay. Yeah. And Makove, can you tell me when I'm running short before I hit my last slide?
I will.
Thank you. I just wanted to start off with a definition because not everybody speaks about the same thing when we talk about a basic income grant. So I refer to a regular, rights-based, unconditional cash transfer paid to individuals. So in other words, I'm not talking about a system where there's a means test or conditions to meet, such as going to the clinic on a monthly basis. I'm also not talking about where there's uncertainty of eligibility, having to prove every month that you're still eligible. Some people refer to payment in kind. The research that I refer to shows that payment in kind, such as seed or food, distorts local markets. People also talk glowingly of payments to households. We've also found that within households, there's often capture of income by hierarchies within that, often patriarchal or age-related hierarchies. If it goes into individuals within a household, there is a benefit where poorer households tend to be larger households. So though it goes to individuals, the more households individuals within a household swell the amount that goes in. And I'm also referring to universal payment through a central register. What needs to be said is that when you look at the total cost of a universal transfer scheme, a lot of people look at the gross costs, but and this is one of the questions you asked, where you claw it back through the income tax or other tax systems, you reduce the cost, so it's a net cost. So that's basically the concept that I'm talking about, is this payment that's going to individuals through the state, but also recovered from people who are above a certain income threshold. You talked earlier, and so did the Statistician General and Colin, about poverty levels, and the Statistician General spoke about multi-dimensions of poverty. I think it is just important to touch base on the question of income poverty, because that is a reality for people, and I'll proceed to talk why income is so important in South Africa. But basically, income poverty has been increasing since 2011. I think it's important for us to recognize what the NIDS-CRAM data, which was a very rapid research survey in April, May 2020, found around the impact of coronavirus. Now, this was before the this DSD grants had gone out, so it's important to recognize that. But without the emergency grants of Stats SA, why do I keep on saying that? Sorry, DSD, 47% of respondents reported that their households ran out of money to buy food in April 2020, which of course was the first month of lockdown. Compared to 21% of households that prior to lockdown had run out of money to buy food. 1 in 5 respondents reported that someone in their household had gone hungry in the previous week, and 1 in 7 reported that a child had gone hungry in the last 7 days. I think from a humanitarian as well as a developmental response, as Colin mentioned, interventions are really important. I think we need to recognize nationally that if people below the food poverty line are not able to develop the cognitive and physical development that we need to have a stable society and a developed society. We talked about the low the low abilities of children in schools, poor children in schools to meet reading and arithmetic requirements. A lot of people attribute this to the conditions in the school, but we need to recognize that that evidence shows that kids are unable to reach that development ability because they don't have the cognitive development because of the malnutrition and starvation. That's just a graphic representation. This comes from the most recent poverty trends report. You can see until 2011, we had a decline in poverty and income poverty, and from 2011 to 2015 on all three poverty lines, we see an increase there. So the question that you asked me is why a universal basic income grant? Mm-hmm. And what I touched on previously is that in South Africa, basically, we are incredibly wage dependent, wages and income in South Africa. And a lot of that is due to previous land dispossession, the prohibition on businesses, and the poor skills transfer, which comes up again in the unemployment rates. So unemployment is extremely high. There are various reasons and drivers for that, including deindustrialization. So my argument is we need to stimulate economic activity beyond the formal labor market. But we need to recognize that with no disposable income, in society, there's no demand. So you cannot kickstart or sustain demand in the absence of disposable income. We've seen state development finance institutions giving out seed money for small business development, but there is no sustaining of that demand in the absence of disposable income, and hence no employment creation through these businesses. So that dependency needs to be interrupted and broken. And here I quote very briefly from a NEDLAC Comprehensive Social Security Task Team report. I'm not sure if I am able to do so, but we've been looking at social security expansion for the last 8 years within NEDLAC. And one of the things that we're looking at right now, as I'm sure Professor Taylor spoke to you about, was a basic income grant. And specifically what we need to factor in is the multiplier impact that a basic income grant could have. So it would pay for itself and again. So there we say that we see that the consultants said that based on analysis of the multiplier effects of the BIG, grant has the potential to positively contribute around 0.5% to GDP growth over the forecast period that they were looking at through improved household demand and therefore also increase the employment rate. That's important to know, is that a basic income grant is capable of ultimately paying for itself. So just very briefly, I was looking at the unemployment figures, and we've got this very strange anomaly that while formal narrow official unemployment fell to 23.3%, the broader definition of unemployment rose to 42%. And I would argue that this shows that the second last bullet point, that the formal labor market is increasingly irrelevant to an increasing number of poor South Africans. So we've seen people stopping looking for work. So it doesn't mean that more people are employed, but people have literally fallen out of the labor market. And I think that this is incredibly dangerous as a situation, because it means that people are being untracked in terms of getting back into the labor market. You see the youth unemployment figure there for the broad definition of unemployment, 73% 50 to 24-year-olds, and 48, just under half for 34-year-olds. So I'm just, I know that this is something that most people are aware of. There is a constitutional obligation on the state to give access to social security. Currently, the social security system only has grants for children, old age pensioners, or people with disabilities. Although that amounts to 80 million grants, which were paid in September 2020, there is no policy in our social security to include working age people into social security. Our social security system is based on a apartheid system which looks after the vulnerable, but is not premised on the fact that working age people would need to have income support. So that is the crisis that we're sitting in. We need to realize that the levels of unemployment in South Africa suggest we need state intervention. What I wanted to say in that regard as well is the social relief of distress grants, which I'll touch on briefly now, is the first time that the state has recognized the need to provide cash support to working age people. And I think that's significant. I think that the state really needs to be applauded. And so looking at what the COVID-19 response by the state is for social security, we need to recognize it's until the end of this month. I just checked with DSD before I came online. There has been no announcement, although there's been a lot of talk about expansion. So that's something which we would really appeal to government to make. certain because a lot of people are in dire distress and are very, very worried. So there's been a top up to the old age pension and disability grant of 250 Rand per month. There is a single payment to caregivers per month for people who receive the child support grant on behalf of children of 500. But the point is that actually renders caregivers ineligible to receive what has been this really significant grant, the Social Relief of Distress grant of 350 Rand, because it means that caregivers officially are in receipt of income, even though they are just proxy recipients for the children, the beneficiaries. So if you look there at the second last large bullet point, 8.9 million applicants were noted by the 4th of September this month, well, this month clearly, 5.5 million people were approved. You can see this at the bottom, 1.8 million people of those were women, 3.7 million were males. The point about a means test in terms of the eligibility is that it discourages any incentive to try and earn an income because it automatically renders you ineligible. So I think those are points to remember. We talk about a universal basic income grant because the impact of the areas of exclusion on the poor and vulnerable are incredibly dire. And they have secondary impacts such as I mentioned there, a disincentive to work. So just in second last slide, you asked about the global findings. The large take home, as has been mentioned by Colin, is that cash transfers stimulate demand. That pro-poor state interventions will decrease inequality and stabilize society, which is something which we're quite concerned about in South Africa, and increasingly so. If you look at the service delivery protesters really are protesting about conditions, not just about service delivery. So what we needed to say here as well is that globally, the most successful interventions in terms of COVID-19 recovery have been aimed at the individual, household, and business. What we've seen really in South Africa is that there's been a lot of emphasis on business intervention and recovery and rescue and guarantees. We argue that you need to invert that. So the pyramid needs to be inverted. You need to be demand shocking from an individual level, which would go up to the household and then support businesses. There are a number of examples globally. So the Alaskan Permanent Fund was introduced in 1976 because of oil, the receipt of oil, but that's been ongoing. It pays an annual dividend. The Namibian Basic Income Grant pilot between 2008 to 2012, right on our doorstep. I think it's important to know that Brazil actually introduced a basic income grant in addition to the Bolsa Familia, which is what everybody talks about. The basic income grant was a shot. It was a payment per month to households in order to reduce the poverty gap, and it effectively lifted everybody out of food poverty because it raised the bar. If you look currently, there's a Spanish targeted grant which has been introduced in March this year, the Ingreso Mínimo Vital program, which is actually a permanent program that was introduced in the midst of COVID, but it is designed to reach beyond as a permanent entitlement. And then it's interesting that Germany, for instance, has just adopted last month a universal basic income grant pilot in order to look at the impact. So there's an ongoing interest in large response to your question. There are permanent examples, and there are still questions around the efficacy in terms of situations, specific situations to both developed and developing world. Now, I'm not going to continue much on this slide because I know that others have looked at it, but my point is that there are ways of financing. I believe that in Colin's Cape Town presentation, he argued for a budget neutral intervention. My argument would be that in this situation of trying to shock our economy into recovery, we need to have something which is not budget neutral, but provides more monies into society, whether that's through quantitative easing, development bonds. There are many modes of financing. But I conclude there was something which Guy Standing, who you've spoken to you before, said on a Rewired podcast I do with Kabula, that we cannot afford not to have a universal basic income. And I think that that is the approach that we need to start from. Not can we afford it, but we need to recognize we can't afford not to. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. And I think before I I bring you back, Mr. Coleman, and we talk about the financing of basic income. I just want to quickly go back to the Statistician General and ask a question based on previous work done on where exactly do South Africans who receive social grants spend their money? What do they mostly spend it on? Because there are some of suggestions that I think, as you mentioned, Colin, may be even insulting, that, well, if you give people this money, they are going to drink it, they're going to smoke it, or they're going to gamble, or, you know, a particularly disturbing picture of the marginalized or those in the periphery. It tends to be projected from time and time again. And I brought the Statistician General to give us statistical facts about the state of South Africa so that we have a bit of a solid background to work from. Now, SG, just to kindly ask if you have any data on where those who are receiving social grants seem to spend most of their money at, I think that would be very helpful.
I'm not, I was struggling to unmute myself. Now I'm back to, what's that, to stage. Oh, I don't have the exact percentages with me here now, but we look at the expenditure in terms of your not quintiles. We look at quintiles, we can look at deciles. But one of the things that we have picked up is that the poorer tend to spend more money on food as well as on transport than your richer or your well-off members of society. But when you look at the number of calories that one needs to take, and I'm talking about food here, that one needs to take, and one speaker amongst a panelist spoke about the whole issue of what people need to have to, especially to prevent things like stunting, wasting, and the like amongst the children to grow. So when you look at the number of calories that people need to take, your poorer members of society tend to buy food, but that's not food that is rich with calories. So it's food as in pap that they buy and all the things that, I mean, milli meal that they will use to cook pap and the like, but it's not rich. So it doesn't, it's more like they are living to eat, not eating to live well. So that's number one. Number two is that the poorer members of our society are far away from places of work. So if you look at, and this is caused by the prevalence, there's still a prevalence of what we call the apartheid spatial framework in South Africa. Because with a few people who come from marginalized communities who have moved to the leafy suburbs, the majority of the people are still in rural areas, in the rural settlements, as well as in townships. So for someone to have to go to work from Soshangube, from Atteridgeville, from Muloto, they spend 4 hours on the road traveling to work every day. Whereas the most affluent, they don't need to travel to buy a newspaper. They read it online. They don't need to travel a lot more to go to meetings. They can actually pick up a phone and make a call. So the poorer ones spend more money on food, but it's not your calories-rich food, as well as on traveling or on transport, actually. Thanks. No, before I conclude on that, we should understand that the face of poverty, as we have indicated, even on unemployment or anything, affects your Black Africans the most, followed by the coloreds. And the Indians are actually catching up with the whites in terms of the lifestyle, including reaching out to education. So when you talk about the poorer and the majority, you are largely talking about collectively your black majority as in Indian, colored, and African, but with the Indians moving out towards to catch up with the whites. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Mr. Coleman, to the extent that that we agree that a basic income grant is not just affordable, but very necessary. What, in your view, and one of the things that really made me write to you was the fact that you crunched numbers in that particular paper. In other words, you made a numbers-based argument and not so much an ideological argument. And I think that's that was particularly helpful because it gave us a much clearer idea of the kind of trade-offs that would likely have to accompany the idea of a basic income in South Africa. And so to the universal basic income, to the extent that we agree that it's a socially just direction to go, what would be a socially just way of funding it in a manner that doesn't necessarily achieve the opposite of what is intended to be achieved?
Thanks. So the 140 billion that I calculated you need, and you can distribute that differently. You can distribute that, across the unemployed South Africans at, 1,080 Rand a month. You can distribute it to the 32 million adults with 365 Rand a month, or the 23 million labor force participants with 500 Rand a month. And that I'm going to leave for the experts to determine the optimal impact. But assuming that we've got a pot of 140 billion Rand that we need to raise in a context where growth is contracting by 8% and we've lost 300 billion Rand of tax income revenue, and therefore the fiscus is very constrained. There's obviously a very big debate about levels of debt to GDP. The US is forecast by the IMF to be at 150%. The UK is somewhere around 110%. Japan is, way off the charts. And South Africa is at over 80%, on a trajectory for going over 100% of GDP in a few years' time. So we have very fiscally constrained environment. So if you talk to the business organizations, they get very anxious about the introduction of a big, in terms of the affordability. So I went through this process of really trying to understand whether it was true that we couldn't afford it, and spoke with top tax experts in the Treasury, in the Davis Commission, and a variety of experts. And I'm not a tax expert, so I interrogated that. And, through a number of repurposing of current tax expenditure, I'm convinced you can save 140 billion and put that in the high impact stimulus basic income grant bucket and have that happen. So to give you examples, I won't go through the whole chart, but it is on the web as it's a public document from my lecture. If you just look at Colin Coleman, UCT Vice Chancellor lecture, you'll find the full chart. But the types of things are, you can save 12.5 billion Rand by eliminating the medical aid tax credit for families over 300 Rand per annum income. So why are we giving medical aid tax credits to these families that can certainly sustain themselves? It's certainly an expenditure that the lower and middle classes, will feel. But it's certainly affordable for them. I talk about removing retirement fund deductions for families over 600,000 Rand of income. Now, again, families are earning over 600,000 Rand of income. It's good for them to be able to save through retirement fund deductions, but it's a pain they, in my humble opinion, can bear. Other big items, if we re-engineer the VAT system credits, and tiering, including an upward adjustment for old age and child support grants to compensate, you ensure a net gain for low-income households, and you save about 19 billion rand. If you introduce a 5% withholding on tax on state procurement contracts, creditable against tax payments, so these people who are at the interface of this highly corrupt and problematic place, where often I would imagine these people are not paying their fair share of tax. And if you make sure that before they get the contracts, that 5% is taken off and they have to register, and then having registered, they will then be able to get that as a tax credit against tax paid and due. So I think there's a number of areas that I talk about in relating to interest rate deductions, et cetera, et cetera. The point being that you don't need to increase VAT, you don't need to increase corporate tax, you don't need, and I would argue it is inadvisable to introduce a wealth tax. Why? Because the tax elasticity in South Africa has probably reached a limit. In other words, people at the higher levels, even though speaking to the African National Congress, it might sound attractive to contemplate taxing the rich more, but you may end up destroying the most important tax base that you have. So it's a highly sensitive thing for a finance minister to contemplate doing, and many people would argue will not be effective because you will get tax avoidance rising against the increased tax rate. So these are very practical ways, and I'm happy to discuss the detail with anybody, for you to raise the 140 billion, and therefore in a fiscally neutral manner, not budget neutral, but fiscally neutral manner, raise sufficient funding to pay for the big. But again, the big will have a number of stimulatory effects, which will increase your tax revenue, both at the corporate tax rate and at the VAT level.
Isobel, your take on just ways, just and sustainable ways of financing a basic income grant in South Africa today?
Thanks very much. I think that I mentioned a couple of those in my presentation. So exploring the increase of a wealth tax. We know that in South Africa, the what people refer to as idle wealth, the untaxed wealth, a lot of it emanating from apartheid days, is incredibly high. And for many, this augurs against the kind of use of wealth that has that would liberate some of the economic activity. So the Davis Tax Committee, as Colin made mention, investigated the question of a wealth tax. While some people argue that the committee found that wealth should not be taxed, in actual fact, what they suggested was that the kinds of the mechanisms and modalities that would be required to tax wealth would need to be implemented over time. And so we argue that that's definitely something that should be looked at. I mean, corporate tax rates have dropped significantly since the time of apartheid. Corporates argue that if you reduce tax on their profits, that would be reinvested in society. Organized labor and many others have argued that, in fact, you've seen an investment strike by capital. We've also seen that capital goes offshore very swiftly, and so the question of a sort of patriotic bourgeoisie and patriotic capital is not something that we're seeing. So the need to look at some kind of speed bump on monies going out is important. I mentioned the fact that many people argue that the GPF, the PIC, and other sort of funds have a huge amount of surplus, which can be utilized and put through in terms of prescribed assets. And that's certainly something which many argue need to be looked at. What we've seen is that the Reserve Bank, as well as National Treasury, in our own analysis, have been resorting to very orthodox approaches to the kind of financing that is available. Now, that in our current situation is not something which we can afford to do. So we argued that, as well as the fact that looking at quantitative easing, what people refer to as a popular quantitative easing, using it for these kind of shock treatments, which can then start repaying themselves as the economy recovers, is critical. Looking at the issuing of longer term government bonds. Globally, people are looking for safe investment havens, and we argue that this would be the kinds of revenue that the state could raise would be important. But Mokove, I just want to argue also that many people from Department of Finance and others would say that the kinds of social spending that we're looking at is a cost, and we really argue that it needs to be looked at as an investment. The Statistician General talked about the kinds of stunting, the effects, picking up from my point, but unless we are investing in human capital, the kinds of investment in infrastructure and other hard expenditure are really not going to have the kinds of medium to long-term interventions. For society, socially, we're not going to have that kind of future.
Well, for all three of you, really, I cannot thank you enough. And as we move closer to our closing statements on this subject matter, I must say that all these conversations that have contributed to our basic income grant debate series are to be collated and synthesized into a working document that I would then share back with you for further commentary and suggestions in writing. And then once all of this is done, this is not talk about talk or talk for talk purposes. This document will then go back to the Social Transformation Committee, which is currently having ongoing discussions about the most effective ways of introducing a basic income grant. And so one did not invite you here for the purpose of talking, but rather for the purpose of enriching this discussion. And I will, it is my responsibility or my job to synthesize these ideas, particularly the various options that you've all raised and the various grounds on which the argument for basic income grant rests. All of this will be synthesized into a document that I will also be able to share with you. But as we get closer to conclusion, there is something that both of you raised before I go to the Statistician General, which stood out for me. And for you, Isobel, was the idea that a basic income grant would pay for itself. For many people, that might sound like an impossible idea to even raise. I remember making the same argument for subsidized higher education for the poor and the working class, and many people thought this is absolutely mad. Now, Mr. Coleman, you raised the issue of how current trends, the extent of social and economic insecurity at the bottom has the potential of not only gobbling the democratic nature of our state, but rather fueling the kind of populism that we've witnessed across Europe that end up threatening everything that we've built thus far. And I would imagine that that is some of the reasons why many people are so interested in actually finding a more not just socially just, but sustainable way of re-engineering how we look at society moving forward. And so when you give your concluding remarks, I would want you to just touch a bit on that and why you think that is such an important point to emphasize within the context of BIG. And I'll start with you, Mr. Coleman, going back to Isobel and then end with the Statistician General.
So thanks very much, Mokove. On this last question you've just asked, I mean, the reality is that when we're at, and I got the numbers wrong earlier, it's the 10.8 plus the 2.2 is 13 million unemployed and 14.1 million employed. That's 48% unemployment. We'll have to interrogate the Stats South Africa report to see how those numbers and the people falling out have affected it. But that's the real world. When you have that real world out there and you have the sort of food insecurity you're talking about, and you have it so racially and gender and age determined, then for those without skills, the African National Congress as a site for patronage is inevitably going to be under attack, because the means for low-skilled people to use political access to gain economic resources will remain a fundamental force. So democracy, somebody said to me very senior, democracy is dying, because what you have is you have the layer of democracy on the surface like a cappuccino, but underneath you have this dramatic contest for resources happening amongst those who absolutely have to get it. And if patronage is the means to get the resources into the hands of the poor, then the political patronage system is a very powerful conveyor belt, whilst the democratic promise of resources in a modern constitutional legal way is a nice idea, but very impractical for a significant slice of the ANC's constituency. So this is the dynamic. Unless we fundamentally deliver the resources in a proper legal, constitutional, democratic way to the ground, we are going to have this problem in the country, in the ANC, in a very significant way. So we have to resolve, and the basic income grant is one of the very practical ways of getting right down to the ground. And for the ruling elite, for the economically powerful, they should see the big as a conveyor belt of peace and democracy into the future. And so it's an economic stimulus, but also it's a stabilizer. And I believe, people need to, as I said right at the beginning, really think deeply about the future and how we're going to maintain the Mandela soul in the ANC and in the country and deliver practical economic resources to those who need it most. So maybe I'll leave it there. I would just maybe just say one last thing, which is, the Davis Committee, the tax committee, has identified 100 billion rand of potential revenue through tax evasion, illegal criminal activity, and we have to take that on. So we have to give them all the help they can get. And the Auditor General has identified 94 billion in the last count that he audited of local, provincial, and central government misuse of funds in various forms, whether wasteful, irregular, or unauthorized expenditures. That is a combined 200 billion rand of management of funds, which is greater than the basic income grant. So if we just drive organized central management in the economy of these basic things, and we spend less time debating, the basic income grant and get on with it, because, we're debating this stuff, but in October, the grant system, as far as I understand it, falls away. You're going to have people, really being in deep trouble. It's like in the US, the stimulus here has come to an end, and, businesses are about to start to fail. So this is a global phenomenon. You have to get on with things. You stop the debate at some point and get on with implementation. But I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks a lot. And I know if it was up to you, we're supposed to be implementing basic income grant as in next month. So not even next month. What's today's date? The 29th. So in the next couple of days. Isabel, before I move to the statistician general, the point is raised, which cannot be avoided, and is the point of political legitimacy. As a researcher, I have synthesized electoral patterns between 1994 and 2019. It is no secret that the most vulnerable of society underwrite the political legitimacy of the African National Congress. It's not something to be debated. And so that's part of the reason why I said what I said in our introduction. But I realized that the Statistician General has a radio interview at 20 minutes past 6. So maybe you will conclude. I will give him just the last bite to say a few words in closing, and then we'll come back to you, Isabel. SG?
Thank you, Mukobe. Let me say that one of the things that as a nation, and indeed other nations of the world, we might want to get as a culture, is to inculcate a culture of evidence-based policy formulation and the planning, monitoring, and evaluation of our programs, including this one on basic income, as well as taking out people out of poverty. We might want to get into that space of poverty, of evidence. Empirical evidence becomes very critical. One of the things, and I know whenever you talk to the African National Congress, you must always be careful about which countries you use as examples, but I'm a statistician, I'm independent, I can use any name. The United States could not enter the Second World War, especially coming out of recession, without, not recession, depression, without gauging its ability to mount a war and potentially even win. They had to use empirical evidence in everything. And while at the time, a lot of power set in Europe, largely in Britain, when I was growing up, England was raised as the most powerful nation, but the whole issue had shifted to the United States. So any nation to be able to win
I'm not sure if the SG is muted. Mr. Maluleke, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh yes, you went silent for a while, but you can conclude.
The whole notion of evidence is critical for the survival of our nation. Evidence for the future of dealing with any programs and policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Isobel, thank you so much, SG. I also know that you have to rush. So thank you so much for making time. And I know you've been in the airwaves since morning. So we genuinely appreciate your contribution to this discussion.
Thank you indeed.
Isobel?
Thank you. I think just very briefly, your opening question is why should South Africa get a universal basic income grant? The Statistician General's unemployment figures that he revealed today, as I said, showed that increasingly people are falling out of the labor market. So employment is not the answer in the immediate term. I also wanted to indicate, I thought I had it on my slide, that 53% of the unemployed do not have matric, and a further 36% have only matric. So we don't have the skills. It's not a question of reskilling people. It's a question of what we do to pull people in to become economically active. You asked why a basic income grant would pay for itself, the kind of multiplier impact. And my argument at the beginning, and the empirical evidence that exists globally shows that when people are pulled in as consumers, they're able to generate the kinds of demand which then stimulates production. If we look at the kinds of reindustrialization impact that we need to have, and there are a number of plans afoot for this, I would argue is the only way that we could get people in as productive members of society in order to address that kind of instability. There is no argument that says that people do not want to have formal employment, but in the absence of formal employment, as Colin said, we can't just leave people on the side. The question of the political legitimacy, I mean, a number of years ago, there were a political economist pointed out, his argument was that in South Africa, social grants buy stability from the poor. He argued that Black economic empowerment looked at transfer of wealth for the elite. So the question has been raised. What is to be done? I'm very surprised that in a democracy where votes count equally, the majority of people remain poor and our inequality is so high, because that statistically doesn't make sense. I think that as the ANC represents the majority of people and represents the dream and ideal of liberation, that the question of the adoption of a basic income grant, as I know is being discussed within the ANC, really, I think needs to come down in favor of a rapid adoption and implementation. People need to have hope. I was talking to Al Jazeera earlier, and the person asked, is there still hope in South Africa given the high levels of unemployment? Leadership, I would argue, national leadership needs to give hope. And a basic income grant seems to be the easiest and and most committed way to ensuring that that happens.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. And I know the Statistician General has already left. I cannot once again thank you enough for taking time to contribute to our basic income grant conversation series that has brought a multiple perspectives and people from different walks of lives to contribute into what would be a socially just South Africa beyond COVID-19. And I have to emphasize that this discussion is necessitated regardless of whether we had COVID-19 or not. I'm taking note of the agency with which you are both advocating for an adoption and implementation of such a policy. I will convey such remarks, those insights on your behalf. And I'm sure I can see my boss is actually here online as well, and everyone else who is listening. I must say the conversation has generated great interest across the entire membership of the African National Congress and South Africans in general, regardless of their political orientation. And I think you have done great justice to the questions that we've posed. If there are any other questions that I receive or we receive that are beyond my comprehension, I will be writing to both of you to explain yourselves further. But for now, I cannot thank you enough. And Mr. Coleman, good morning that side in the Big Apple. And Isobel, thank you so much for taking your evening to chat to us. And I cannot thank you enough. I look forward to further taking part in this conversation with both of you beyond this particular webinar.
All the best from me. Thank you.
Definitely. Thanks for the invitation.
Pleasure. Cheers.